Duke scarred and shunned by all, finds love in the woman who saw the man. The statement was a cruel jest whispered in the gilded ballrooms of the capital, a pitiless headline for a life lived in the shadows. For Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, it was the cold, hard truth of his existence, a verdict carved not just onto his face but into the very stone of his soul. In his vast, echoing fortress, surrounded by portraits of handsome, whole ancestors, he was a monarch of dust and silence. The war had taken half his face, leaving a brutal tapestry of scarred flesh from temple to jaw, and in doing so, it had taken the man he was supposed to be. Now, he was only the Beast of Blackwood, a title he wore with the same stoic resignation as his ducal signet ring. A letter lay on his mahogany desk, its perfumed paper a stark violation of the room's musty air. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess, wrote of duty, of legacy, of the pressing, damnable need for an heir. She suggested a parade of suitable aristocratic daughters, their pedigrees as flawless as their porcelain skin. Alistair saw only their imagined flinches, their veiled horror, the polite revulsion that would curdle into a lifetime of shared misery. He would not subject another to his monstrousness, nor himself to their pity. Duke scarred and shunned by all, finds love in the woman who saw the man. Hundreds of miles away, where the Duke's lands frayed into humble villages, that same sentiment would have been met with blank confusion. Here, struggles were not of legacy but of survival. For Alara, the world was not a ballroom but a damp cottage that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. Her hands, chapped and stained with plant tinctures, were rarely still. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her brow furrowed in concentration as she ground feverfew for a neighbor's ailing child. Her father, the village's former healer, sat by the hearth, his own hands now twisted and useless with rheum. His legacy was not in titles but in the knowledge he had passed to his daughter, a legacy that paid in gratitude but rarely in coin. The last of their savings had dwindled to a few pitiful shillings, and the worry was a constant, gnawing ache in Alara's chest, more persistent than any winter chill. She possessed a deep, abiding kindness, a practical intelligence that saw the root of a problem and sought to mend it, whether it was a fever or a fraying hem. It was a quality profoundly underestimated by a world that valued dowries over dignity. The inciting incident arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the clatter of fine carriage wheels on the village's muddy track. A man in the severe livery of Blackwood Manor, the Duke's steward, stepped out, his polished boots sinking into the mire. He carried an offer that sounded like a fable, a position for a lady's companion. The Duke, he explained, had a young, reclusive ward who required a steadying presence. The pay was a fortune, enough to see her father comfortable for years. The villagers murmured, their fear of the monstrous Duke warring with their awe at the sum. For Alara there was no choice. The fear was a distant shadow. The reality of her father's shivering form by a dying fire was immediate and sharp. She ignored the whispers about the beast in the castle, the tales of his terrifying visage and volatile temper. She would be a companion to a lonely girl. How difficult could that be? She packed her few belongings, 2 simple dresses, her father's book of herbal remedies, and a heart full of desperate hope. Her world was about to collide with Alistair's, not through a marriage plot, but through a deception far more intricate and perilous. Alistair, in his lonely fortress, had finalized his own plan. He would not be the Duke. He would be Alec, a scarred and surly groundskeeper. He would hire a companion for a phantom ward and observe her from afar, then from up close. He would test her, bait her, and prove his cynical theory, that no woman could see past the monster to the man. It was a cruel test, born of profound pain, and Alara was walking directly into its snare. Alara's first impression of Blackwood Manor was of being swallowed whole. The carriage passed through iron gates that groaned like a dying man, and proceeded up a drive choked with weeds and shadowed by ancient, skeletal oaks. The manor itself was a Gothic monstrosity of gray stone, its multitude of windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world it no longer wished to see. Rain began to fall, a miserable, persistent drizzle that seemed to weep down the stone walls, streaking them with black. Inside, the air was cold and still. A severe, rail-thin housekeeper named Mrs. Gable met her at the door, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. "Miss Alara," she stated, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. "The Duke expects punctuality. Your duties are to the Lady Annalise. You will find she is delicate. She keeps to her rooms." Alara was shown to a small, Spartan chamber in a disused wing of the castle. It was clean but utterly joyless. The silence was the most unnerving part. In her village, there was always the sound of life. Children playing, a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle. Here, the silence was a presence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind and the incessant ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, counting away the seconds of her gilded imprisonment. For 3 days, she saw no one but Mrs. Gable, who brought her meals on a tray and informed her that Lady Annalise was not receiving the phantom ward remained a phantom. Loneliness, a feeling Alara had rarely known, began to creep in. She felt like a ghost haunting a mausoleum. Determined not to succumb to despair, Alara decided to explore the grounds. If she was to be confined, she would at least breathe fresh air. She found a door leading out to what had once been a magnificent rose garden. Now it was a ruin. Thorny, overgrown canes snaked across the path, strangling the life from a few resilient blooms that still struggled to reach the light. It was a place of profound neglect, a perfect mirror of the house itself. And it was there she first saw him. He was on his knees, wrestling with a particularly monstrous thicket of briars, his back to her. He was a large man, dressed in the rough, earth-stained clothes of a laborer. As he moved, she saw the side of his face. She drew in a sharp breath. The stories had not exaggerated. A web of angry, puckered scars stretched from his hairline down his cheek, pulling at the corner of his eye and mouth and giving him a permanent, grimacing snarl. This must be one of the Duke's men. He seemed as broken and wild as the garden he tended. Alistair felt her presence before he saw her. A shift in the air, a scent of soap and something clean, like lavender. He'd been watching her from the windows, this quiet, unassuming girl. He'd seen her pace her room, seen her stand at the window looking not with fear, but with a kind of weary frustration. Now she was here, in his sanctuary of thorns. He braced himself for the inevitable reaction. The gasp, the averted eyes, the hasty retreat. He turned his head slowly, deliberately exposing the ruined side of his face to her full view. "The gardens are private," he growled, his voice a low rasp he hadn't used in conversation for weeks. Alara did not flinch. She did not look away. Her gaze was direct, and to his astonishment, it held not revulsion, but a thoughtful curiosity. Her eyes went from his face to the tangled mess of roses, then back to his gloved hands, one of which was bleeding from a thorn that had pierced the worn leather. "They look like they could use another pair of hands," she said, her voice calm and even. "My father taught me about gardens. You have to be ruthless with the dead wood to let the new growth through." Alistair was momentarily speechless. He had expected fear or pity. He had not expected practical advice. He narrowed his good eye, suspicious. Was this part of the act? A ploy to ingratiate herself? "I manage on my own," he bit out, turning back to his work. "Clearly?" she replied, with a faint, almost imperceptible trace of irony. She gestured to a nearby bench nearly swallowed by ivy. "I am Alara. I was hired as a companion for the Lady Annalise, but she seems to have no need of me. I would rather be useful than sit idle." "The name's Alec," he grunted, yanking a stubborn root from the earth. Alec. The name felt foreign and false on his tongue. It was the name of a simple man, a man without a title, without a history, a man who was only what she saw before her, a scarred groundskeeper. This was the first part of his test. "Well, Alec," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You are bleeding." She took a step closer, and for the first time in years, Alistair felt an instinct to retreat. He held his ground. "I have some knowledge of healing. If you'll allow me, I can clean that." It will fester otherwise. He stared at her, his mind reeling. She was offering to tend to him, to touch him. This was not in his script. His plan was to observe her, to listen to her complain about her isolation to Mrs. Gable, to confirm his bitterest expectations. It was not for her to invade his private ruin and offer him aid. "It's a scratch," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "All wounds start as a scratch," she replied softly. "It's neglect that makes them poison." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Neglect that makes them poison. Was she speaking of his hand, or of this entire blighted estate? Or was she, in her innocence, speaking of his very soul? He looked from her clear, earnest eyes to the overgrown garden, a symbol of his own untended heart. For the first time, a crack appeared in the fortress of his cynicism. He gave a curt, reluctant nod, and watched as she knelt beside him, her proximity a strange and terrifying warmth in his cold world. The sky, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally broke. A sudden, violent squall swept across the estate, turning the drizzle into a torrential downpour. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, and a loud crack of splintering would echoed from the far end of the garden. Alistair, startled, tried to stand too quickly. The damp earth, now slick with mud, gave way beneath him. He slipped, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle as a heavy section of the dilapidated greenhouse's rotting timber frame, loosened by the storm, crashed down, pinning his ankle to the ground. A sharp, searing pain shot up his leg, and a curse was ripped from his throat. Alara, who had taken shelter under the overhang of a stone archway, ran to him without a second's thought. The rain plastered her simple dress to her frame and streamed down her face, but her eyes were clear and focused. She saw the blood seeping through his trousers, the unnatural angle of his foot, the raw agony on his face. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm. She knelt in the mud beside him, her hands immediately assessing the situation. The beam was heavy, waterlogged, and old. "I cannot lift this alone." "Go. Get help from the house," Alistair grunted through clenched teeth. The pain was a white-hot fire, but the humiliation was worse. To be brought low, trapped and helpless, before her. "There is no time," she said, her practical nature taking over. She looked around frantically, her gaze landing on a discarded iron pry bar lying near the crumbling wall. "Hold on," she scrambled to retrieve it, the mud sucking at her shoes. With a strength he wouldn't have thought she possessed, she wedged the bar under the beam. "When I lift, you must pull your leg free. Do you understand?" He stared at her, rain and sweat mingling on his face. In this moment, she was not a servant girl or the subject of his cruel experiment. She was a force of nature, as wild and determined as the storm raging around them. He saw no fear of him, no disgust at his scarred face, now twisted in pain. He saw only a profound, desperate will to help. He nodded, gritting his teeth. "Now!" she cried, putting her entire weight onto the lever. The beam lifted just an inch, but it was enough. With a guttural cry, Alistair dragged his leg free. The moment it was clear, Alara let the beam crash back to the earth, her body trembling with the exertion. She was immediately at his side, her hands gently probing the injured ankle. "It's broken, I think." Or badly sprained, her touch was firm, professional, yet impossibly gentle. It was the touch of a healer. He flinched, not from the pain, but from the contact itself. It had been years since anyone had touched him with such uncomplicated kindness. The nurses after the war had been efficient, his valet was deferential, but this was different. This was human connection, raw and unvarnished. "We need to get you out of this rain," she said, her voice softening. "Your cottage, is it near?" He pointed numbly towards a small stone structure barely visible through the downpour. "There." Getting him there was an ordeal. He leaned heavily on her, his arms slung over her small shoulders. Her strength was astonishing. She bore his weight without complaint, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Inside the small, rustic cottage, a fire was laid in the hearth, unlit. It was his private escape from the grand emptiness of the manor, a place where he was just Alec. With fumbling hands, she helped him to a worn armchair before turning to light the fire. Soon, a small, cheerful blaze was crackling, pushing back the damp and the cold. She knelt before him, carefully slitting the fabric of his trouser leg with a small knife from her pocket. The sight of his ankle, swollen and discolored, made her draw a sharp, sympathetic breath. She looked up at him, her expression one of pure concern. "This will hurt," she warned, before her hands began the work of setting the bone as best she could. As she worked, wrapping his ankle with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat, he found himself speaking. The words came out, disjointed and raw, prompted by the pain and the sheer, disorienting novelty of her care. "The war, it teaches you about pain. You think you know its limits. You don't." She didn't respond with empty platitudes. She simply paused, her hands still on his ankle, and met his gaze. "The war took my uncle," she said softly. "It takes something from everyone." It was a simple statement, but it forged a bond in the small, firelit room. He wasn't the monstrous duke. She wasn't a mere servant. They were two people, finding shelter from a storm, connected by a shared understanding of loss. This was the first crack in his armor. In that moment, he wasn't testing her. He was simply a man named Alec, being cared for by a woman named Alara. And as she finished her work, securing the splint, he revealed another small, true piece of himself, a detail he hadn't planned. "This garden, it was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She loved roses. He had intended to remain a closed book, a surly enigma. But her quiet competence, her utter lack of revulsion, had breached his defenses in a way no cannon fire ever could. She had touched his wound, both the one on his ankle and the deeper one he carried inside, and had not recoiled. She had only offered solace. The days that followed the storm fell into a new, unexpected rhythm. Alistair, confined to his cottage with his injured ankle, found his carefully constructed solitude irrevocably breached. Alara became a daily visitor, arriving each morning with a basket containing bread and cheese from the manor's kitchen, and a poultice of comfrey and arnica from her own dwindling supply of herbs. She would change the dressing on his ankle with a practiced efficiency that was both intimate and utterly professional, her fingers brushing against his skin, sending jolts of warmth through his system that had nothing to do with healing. Mrs. Gable was told only that the groundskeeper had suffered an accident and that Alara, with her healing knowledge, was attending him at the Duke's unspoken command. The lie was a flimsy shield, but it held. "You should be resting, not tending to me," Alistair grumbled one morning, the words a familiar armor of gruffness he no longer felt. "And you should be resting, not trying to walk on that ankle," she retorted, gently pushing him back into his chair. "Besides, Lady Annalise remains indisposed. Tending to your stubbornness is the most useful thing I've done since I arrived." A faint smile touched his lips before he could suppress it. He found himself looking forward to her arrivals, to the sound of her light footsteps on the gravel path. They would sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer strained, but comfortable. He learned about her life in the village, about the father she adored, about the simple joys of a community harvest. Her world was small, but it was vibrant and full of connection, a stark contrast to his own vast, empty existence. She, in turn, slowly coaxed stories out of Alec. She learned that the scars were from a battle, a fact he offered reluctantly, but she did not press for gory details. Instead, she asked what it was like to see the sea for the first time, or what the food tasted like in a foreign land. She was interested in the man, not the soldier. She saw the garden not as a ruin, but as a place full of promise. "This one," she said one afternoon, pointing to a particularly thorny, gnarled bush. "This is a gloire de Dijon. My mother had one. If we prune it back hard and feed the soil, it will give the most beautiful, fragrant blooms next summer. They smell of tea and apricots." He looked at the tangled mess of thorns and saw only decay. She looked at it and saw the future. Under her guidance, he began to direct her from his chair, telling her which branches to cut, which roots to dig. He, the Duke of Blackwood, was taking orders from a village girl, and he found he did not mind. In fact, he found a sliver of peace in the shared, simple task. Her presence was like sunlight on the neglected soil of his heart. This growing intimacy, however, was a double-edged sword. Every kind word from her, every shared smile, every moment of genuine connection, twisted the knife of his deception deeper into his own gut. He was falling for the woman he was trying to fool. The entire premise of his test was that she would fail, that she would eventually reveal a flaw, a hint of greed or revulsion. But she did not. She was exactly as she seemed, kind, resilient, and utterly without artifice. He was the one who was false. "Why do you stay here, Alec?" she asked one evening, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "In this place. It feels so sad." "I belong here," he answered, the words more true than she could possibly know. "With the other broken things." "Nothing is broken forever," she said softly, her gaze holding his. "Only neglected." He wanted to confess then. He wanted to tell her everything. Who he was, why he had lied, how her presence had become the single point of light in his suffocating darkness. But the words caught in his throat. How could he? The man she was growing to care for, this simple, scarred Alec, did not exist. He was a fiction. The truth would not set him free. It would destroy the one fragile, beautiful thing he had ever managed to build. He was trapped between the lie he had created and the truth that would surely make her despise him. The weight of it was becoming unbearable, a far heavier burden than any ducal responsibility he had ever shouldered. He was falling in love with her, and he was doing it on entirely false ground. The thought was both a moment of transcendent joy and a premonition of absolute doom. The midpoint of Alistair's carefully orchestrated deception arrived not with a quiet revelation, but with the screech of carriage brakes and the imperious rap of a silver-headed cane against the manor's front door. The Dowager Duchess, his Aunt Augusta, had arrived. She swept into the hall like a hawk descending on a field mouse, her black silk dress rustling with disapproval, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. "Alistair," she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Show yourself. This charade has gone on long enough." Mrs. Gable, pale and trembling, informed her that the Duke was indisposed. This was a lie the Dowager was not inclined to accept. She had come to see progress, to inspect prospective brides, not to be fobbed off by servants. Her arrival sent a shockwave through the fragile piece of Blackwood. Alistair, hearing the commotion from his cottage, felt a cold dread seep into his bones. His aunt was a force of nature, one who would not tolerate secrets or subterfuge, especially his. Elara, returning from the garden, nearly collided with the formidable woman in the main hall. The Dowager looked her up and down, her gaze lingering on Elara's simple, earth-stained dress with open contempt. "And who, pray tell, is this?" she demanded of Mrs. Gable, not deigning to address Elara directly. "This is Miss Elara, Your Grace, the Lady Annalise's companion." "Annalise?" the Dowager scoffed. "My nephew has no ward named Annalise. What foolishness is this?" The blood drained from Elara's face. "No ward? Then what was she doing here?" The foundation of her world at Blackwood began to crack. Before she could process the shock, the Dowager's sharp eyes caught sight of a figure hobbling across the distant lawn. Alistair, unable to stay away, trying to intercept his aunt before she discovered his ruse. "And that man," the Dowager snapped, pointing a finger, "the groundskeeper? He has the look of a ruffian. Why is he allowed to roam so freely? In my day, staff knew their place." She turned her suspicious glare back on Elara. "You seem to have a particular familiarity with the grounds." And with him, Alistair knew he had to act. He could not allow Elara to face his aunt's venomous interrogation. That evening, as a tense and miserable silence fell over the main house, he went to her. Not to her room in the manor, but he waited for her by the gate to the gardens, a place that had become theirs. She is a difficult woman, he said, his voice low. My aunt, he had almost said the Duke's aunt. The slip was a near thing. She said there is no Lady Annalise, Elara stated, her voice trembling slightly. She said the Duke has no ward. Why am I here, Alec? The direct question was a blow. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. So he deflected, seizing on the immediate threat. The Duke is eccentric. His aunt doesn't understand. But her presence here makes things complicated. She will make trouble for you. He looked away, toward the dark woods that bordered the estate. There's a place, a lake, deep in the woods. It's quiet there, peaceful. I can take you there tomorrow. Away from the house. Away from her. It was a desperate move, an act of self-preservation masquerading as protection for her. He needed to get her away from his aunt's prying eyes, to buy himself time, to hold onto this fragile reality just a little longer. She searched his face in the twilight, his scars thrown into sharp relief. She saw the desperation in his good eye, the tension in his jaw. She was confused and hurt by the mystery of her employment. But the one solid thing in this strange, sad place was him. Alec, the man who spoke of roses and war, the man whose pain she had touched. She trusted him. All right, Alec, she whispered. Take me away from here. The next day, under the pretense of gathering rare mosses for her remedies, they escaped. As they walked toward the woods, the Dowager Duchess watched from an upstairs window, her lips pursed into a thin, merciless line. She saw the village girl and the scarred groundskeeper walking together, a little too closely. She did not know who the man was, but she recognized the proprietary way he guided the girl, the way the girl looked at him. It was an intimacy that transgressed class, and in her world such transgressions were cancers to be cut out. She turned to Mrs. Gable. Tell me everything you know about that man. That, Alec, the investigation had begun. The stakes had just been raised immeasurably. Alistair had saved Elara from an immediate confrontation, but in doing so he had sealed their fate. The lake was a secret jewel hidden deep within the Blackwood estate. A basin of clear, cold water surrounded by ancient pines, its surface a perfect mirror for the sky. The air was clean, scented with pine needles and damp earth. Here the oppressive weight of the manor fell away. The Dowager Duchess and her suspicions, the phantom ward, the very concept of duke and servant. It all seemed to belong to another world. Here, there were only two people, a man and a woman, standing on the threshold of a profound connection. They spent the day in a bubble of stolen time. He showed her where the deer came to drink at dawn, the ancient, moss-covered stone that, according to legend, marked the heart of the forest. He spoke more freely than he ever had before, the persona of Alec feeling less like a costume and more like a skin he wished he could live in forever. He told her not of battles, but of the crushing loneliness that came after, of the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. Sometimes I felt the scars weren't just on my face, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper as they sat on the shore, skipping stones across the water's placid surface. I felt they had erased me entirely, that people could no longer see a person, just the damage. Elara stopped, a smooth, flat stone in her hand. She turned to him, her expression achingly sincere. When I look at you, Alec, I don't see damage, she said, her voice soft but sure. I see strength. I see a man who has endured something terrible and has not been broken by it. Your scars don't hide you. They are a part of your story. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently, tentatively, tracing the largest of the scars on his cheek. His breath hitched. Her touch was not one of pity or morbid curiosity. It was a touch of acceptance, of reverence. It was a validation he had not realized he was starving for. In that moment, the lie, the test, the title, it was all ash. All that mattered was the feel of her skin against his, the look of utter sincerity in her eyes. The carefully constructed walls around his heart did not just crack. They crumbled into dust. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of violet and rose, the air grew thick with unspoken feelings. The shared day, the deep confession, her incredible acceptance. It all culminated in a silence that was more potent than any words. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a subject in an experiment, but the architect of his undoing and his salvation. The dramatic irony was a tangible thing, a chasm between them that only he could see. He was a duke, playing a pauper, and he had fallen hopelessly in love with the one woman in the world who would despise him most when she learned the truth. But in the twilight magic of the hidden lake, the truth seemed a distant, flimsy thing. Reality was here. It was her. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her eyes fluttered shut, a silent invitation. His lips met hers, tentatively at first, then with a desperate, pent-up longing that shook him to his core. It was not the kiss of a duke claiming a prize. It was the kiss of a drowning man breathing air for the first time. It was a kiss of pure, honest connection, a moment of absolute truth built on a foundation of absolute deceit. For Alara, the kiss was the culmination of a feeling she hadn't dared to name. The gruff, lonely man had revealed a soul of such profound depth and sorrow. She was drawn to his resilience, to the kindness he tried so hard to conceal. Kissing him felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. Felt right, felt real. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the last light of day was fading. The bubble had to burst. They had to return to the manor, to the world of lies and secrets. Alistair felt a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, immediately followed by a wave of sickening dread. He had reached the highest peak, the one perfect moment of connection. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fall from this height would be devastating. The calm was over. The storm was about to break. Their return to the castle was like stepping from a dream back into a waking nightmare. The warmth of their shared day by the lake evaporated the moment the oppressive gray stones of Blackwood Manor came into view. The air was charged with a tense, waiting silence. A single lamp burned in the Duke's study, a solitary yellow eye in the dark facade of the house. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, with a sick certainty, that the time for his deception had run out. As they entered the main hall, Mrs. Gable appeared, her face pale and drawn. She avoided Alistair's gaze, looking only at Alara. "Miss Alara," she said, her voice a strained whisper, "the Dowager Duchess requests your presence." In the Duke's study, Alistair's blood ran cold. "I will go," he said, his voice a low growl. "No, Alec," Alara said softly, placing a hand on his arm. The feel of her touch, so recently a source of joy, was now a brand of his betrayal. "It's all right. I am an employee here. I must answer when I am summoned. I am not afraid of her." Her bravery was a knife in his gut. She was walking into the trap he had set, and she was doing it with a courage he himself lacked. He couldn't stop her without revealing everything right there in the hall. He could only watch, helpless, as she squared her shoulders and walked towards the study, towards the precipice. He wanted to run, to flee back to the woods and live as Alec forever. But he couldn't. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He had started this, and he had to see it through to its bitter end. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he went not to his cottage, but through a side entrance and up a private staircase that led to the back of his study. He had to be there. He owed her that much. Alara pushed open the heavy oak door. The room was vast, lined with thousands of books that seemed to absorb all sound. The Dowager Duchess sat in a high-backed chair near the massive fireplace, her expression one of cold triumph. But it was not the old woman who commanded Alara's attention. Standing by the grand mahogany desk, silhouetted against the lamplight, was another man. He was dressed not in the rough clothes of a groundskeeper, but in a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue velvet, his linen shirt pristine, his boots polished to a mirror shine. As he turned from the window to face her, the light caught his face. The scars were the same. The intense, haunted eyes were the same. But everything else was different. The posture was no longer the weary slump of a laborer, but the erect, commanding bearing of an aristocrat. The hand that rested on the desk was not calloused and stained with dirt, but clean, with a heavy gold signet ring on one finger. It was Alec, and it was not Alec at all. Alara's mind struggled to reconcile the two images. The kind, broken man from the garden and this powerful, imposing stranger. A terrible, sickening understanding began to dawn. The Dowager Duchess rose, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Miss Alara," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You have been enjoying the rustic charms of our groundskeeper, I believe. Allow me to introduce you to him properly. This is my nephew, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood." The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The Duke, the Beast of Blackwood, the eccentric, reclusive master of the house was the man she had tended, the man she had confided in, the man she had kissed. Her eyes flew to his face, searching for some sign, any sign that this was a horrible mistake. She found none. She saw only a mask of profound misery, an agony that mirrored her own burgeoning horror. Every shared moment, every quiet conversation, every flicker of trust replayed in her mind, now tainted, twisted into a grotesque parody. The concern for his ankle, the stories of the garden, the confession by the lake. It wasn't a connection being forged. It was a performance, a test. She had been the subject of some cruel, aristocratic game. The intimacy she had felt, the love that had been blooming in her heart, was all based on a lie. He had not been showing her his true self. He had been watching her, judging her. The humiliation was a hot, searing wave, so intense it made her feel dizzy. "Why?" The word was a choked, broken whisper. It was all she could manage. Alistair took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. "Alara, please." She flinched back as if he were fire, her own hand flying to her mouth. The man she had kissed by the lake was a phantom. This man, this Duke, was a stranger. A cruel, manipulative stranger who had played with her heart for his own amusement. "Don't," she gasped, tears finally breaking free, hot and shameful, down her cheeks. "Don't you dare touch me." Without another word, without a glance at the triumphant dowager, she turned and fled. She ran from the study, from the castle, from the man who had meticulously built up her trust only to shatter it so completely. The sound of her footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall was the sound of his world breaking apart. The crisis he had engineered was here, and it was 1,000 times more devastating than he had ever imagined. He had wanted to test a woman's heart, and in the process, he had revealed the utter blackness of his own. Alara did not stop running. She ran past the aghast Mrs. Gable, out the massive front doors she had entered with such trepidation weeks before, and into the cold, unforgiving night. The rain had started again, a miserable, chilling downpour that mimicked the storm in her soul. She didn't care. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the hateful silhouette of Blackwood Manor was swallowed by the darkness behind her. She did not return to her room. There was nothing for her there. Her meager belongings were meaningless. The money she was owed was tainted, the price of her humiliation. She stumbled through the night, guided by a primal need to put distance between herself and him. Every memory was now poison. His pained grimace when she tended his ankle, was he acting? His soft-spoken words about his mother's roses, a calculated script? The kiss. Oh God, the kiss. Had it been the final, cruel flourish of his experiment? The thought was a physical agony, a twisting in her gut more painful than any hunger or cold. She finally collapsed at the edge of the woods, huddled at the base of a great oak, and let the sobs rack her body until she was empty and shivering. She was not just heartbroken. She felt erased. The woman who had shared her heart with Alec had been a fool, a naive country girl duped by a bored, cruel nobleman. But as the miserable night wore on, and the cold seeped into her bones, something else began to stir beneath the grief. A hard, resilient core of anger. He would not break her. She was the daughter of a healer, a woman who knew how to mend things. She would mend herself. She was not a plaything. She was Alara. She had worth, She had skills. She had a life that existed entirely outside his dark, manipulative world. By dawn, the tears had dried. Her heart was a shattered ruin, but her spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. She rose, her dress torn and muddied, and began the long walk home, her jaw set with a new, grim determination. She would not be his victim. She would survive this. Back at the manor, Alistair stood frozen in the study, the dowager's smug pronouncements washing over him unheard. He felt as though he had been disemboweled. The sight of Alara's face, the dawning horror, the utter devastation, the final, cutting accusation in her eyes, was burned into his mind. He had engineered this. He had taken her genuine kindness, her trust, her burgeoning love, and he had thrown it back in her face as a lie. "Well," his aunt said, snapping him from his stupor, "that's the end of that little distraction. Now we can focus on finding you a suitable duchess. Lady Annabel's father has extensive holdings that border our own." "Get out," Alistair said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "What did you say to me?" "I said," he repeated, turning to face her, his expression so ferocious that even the indomitable dowager took a step back, "Get out of my house. Now." He was no longer playing a part. This was the unrestrained fury of the Duke of Blackwood, and it was terrible to behold. His aunt, for the first time in her life, was silenced. She gathered her dignity and swept from the room, defeated. But her departure brought him no relief. He was alone, utterly, completely alone in the echoing silence of his self-made prison. The cottage, the garden, the lake, they were all poisoned now, monuments to his own cowardice. He had been so afraid of being rejected for his scars that he had created a scenario where he would be rejected for his soul. And he deserved it. He saw with blinding, agonizing clarity that his test was never about finding a worthy woman. It was a craven defense mechanism, designed to prove his own cynical worldview correct, to protect himself from the possibility of ever having to be vulnerable. Alara hadn't failed his test. He had failed hers. She had offered him a chance at genuine connection, and he had been too much of a coward to take it as himself. The silence of the castle was no longer a comfort. It was a roar, amplifying the sound of his own lost hope. The man she had come to care for, Alec, was a better man than he, the Duke, had ever been. And he had just killed him. Days bled into a week. Alistair remained at Blackwood, a ghost in his own home. He dismissed his aunt's frantic letters, ignored his steward's reports. He wandered the empty rooms, the garden, the path to the lake, each step a fresh torment. He saw her everywhere, kneeling in the mud to help him, smiling in the firelight, her eyes full of a trust he had systematically destroyed. The pain of her absence was a physical ache, a hollowness that dwarfed any wound the war had ever inflicted. He finally understood. The scars on his face were trivial. The true disfigurement was the fear and cynicism he had allowed to fester in his heart. He had to do something. An apology was insufficient. Words were meaningless after the depth of his deception. He couldn't command her to return, and he couldn't buy her forgiveness. He had to earn it, and earning it meant shedding the last vestiges of his pride and his title. It meant becoming the man she had thought he was, not Alec the groundskeeper, but an honest man, vulnerable and true. He learned from a chastened Mrs. Gable that Alara had taken nothing, refusing the generous wages left for her. She had simply vanished. His heart seized with fear, but then a rider, sent to her village under the guise of settling a tenancy dispute, returned with news. She was home. She was safe. She had thrown herself into caring for her father and the community, organizing the collection and drying of herbs for the winter, her quiet dignity a shield against the pitying glances of her neighbors. He knew what he had to do. It would not be a grand gesture of wealth. It would be a gesture of the soul. He called for his horse, not the Duke's gleaming black stallion, but a sturdy, unremarkable gelding from the stables. He dressed not in velvet and linen, but in simple, durable clothes, not unlike the ones he had worn as Alec. He would not arrive in a ducal carriage, a symbol of the power and status that had created the chasm between them. He would go to her as a man, alone. He rode out from Blackwood, leaving the title, the wealth, and the pride behind. He was riding towards his judgment, with nothing to offer but a shattered heart and a desperate, flickering hope for redemption. The journey to Ilara's village was a pilgrimage of penance. With every mile that passed, the grandeur of Blackwood receded, and the reality of the world she inhabited came into sharper focus. He rode through fields tilled by hand, past cottages with sagging roofs, and saw the hard, unvarnished truth of a life lived without the buffer of a title. This was her world, the world he had invaded with his careless, cruel game. When he finally arrived, he was just a lone rider on a tired horse, covered in the dust of the road. He found her not in her cottage, but in a small, communal plot of land behind the village church. She was on her knees just as he had first seen her, but this time she was not wrestling with thorns. She was tending to neat rows of medicinal herbs, her hands moving with familiar, focused grace. Several village women worked alongside her, their quiet chatter a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of his castle. She had created her own garden, a place of healing and community. As he dismounted and walked towards the low stone wall bordering the plot, a hush fell over the women. They recognized the scars, if not the man. Ilara looked up, her body going rigid, the color drained from her face, replaced by a cold, guarded mask. The open, trusting warmth he remembered was gone, replaced by the deep, unforgiving hurt he had put there. He stopped at the wall, making no move to enter her space. This had to be on her terms. "Ilara," he said, his voice rough, stripped of all ducal authority. It was the voice of the man from the cottage. She rose slowly, wiping her earthy hands on her apron. She faced him, her chin held high. "Your Grace," she said, the title a block of ice between them. "You are a long way from home. If you have come to offer payment, I do not want it." "I haven't come to offer you money," he said, his heart aching at the distance in her voice. He had to do this here, in front of her community, the people whose respect she valued. His humiliation had to be as public as her worth was evident. "I have come to apologize, though the word is too small for what I did." He took a deep breath, meeting her unwavering, wounded gaze. "What I did was monstrous, far more monstrous than any scar. I was a coward, hiding behind a lie because I was terrified. I believed no one could see past this." He gestured to his face. "And in my arrogance and my fear, I set out to prove it. I never imagined I would find someone like you. Someone who saw not a monster, or a duke, or a groundskeeper, but just a man in pain." His voice cracked. "The man you knew as Alec, he wasn't entirely a lie, Ilara. He was the man I wished I could be. The man you made me want to be. You showed me kindness when all I had known was duty and fear. You touched my wounds, both of them, and you did not recoil. You offered me a chance at something real, and I was too afraid to take it honestly." He looked around at the village, at the infirmary, little more than a single room in the back of the church. "Your work here, your skill, it's real. It has value beyond anything I possess." He turned back to her, his next words costing him the last of his ducal pride. "I want to help, not as a gift from a duke, but as a partnership. I will fund the building of a proper infirmary for this village, for this whole region, with a laboratory for your remedies, rooms for the sick, everything it needs. But my name will not be on it. Yours will. You will run it. You will have full autonomy. It will be your creation, a testament to your worth, not a debt to me." This was his grand gesture. Not a shower of jewels, but the recognition of her agency, her talent. It was an offering of respect, not charity. Ilara stared at him, her internal walls trembling. This was not the arrogant duke she had imagined. This was a man stripped bare, his vulnerability as raw and visible as his scars. But the wound was still too deep. "And you think building a hospital can buy my forgiveness?" she asked, her voice shaking. "No," he said immediately, his sincerity a palpable force. Nothing can buy it. It must be earned. And I know I may never earn it. He took another, final step in his self-immolation. If you tell me to leave and never return, I will. I will establish the funds with the village elders and you will never have to see me again. Or, if you would ever consider it, I would give it all up. The title, the lands, Blackwood. I would live here as just Alec and work with my hands, and spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you once thought I was. The choice is yours. I am done with lies and tests. I am placing my fate, my hope, entirely in your hands. The final twist landed with breathtaking force. He was offering to abdicate his entire world for a chance with her. He was not asking her to become a duchess. He was asking if he could become her husband, simply as a man. Tears welled in Alara's eyes. Not of humiliation this time, but of a complex, overwhelming storm of emotion. She saw before her not the Duke, not Alec, but Alistair. A man who had traveled from the depths of cynical despair to this moment of profound, humble truth. He had finally seen himself, and now he was finally letting her see him, too. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of two lives hanging in the balance. Alara looked from Alistair's earnest, pleading face to the small garden she had cultivated, a place of healing born from her own pain. She had told him once that nothing was broken forever, only neglected. He had neglected his own heart, and she had guarded hers fiercely after he broke it. But perhaps some things, with enough care, could be mended. Slowly, deliberately, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, not to his scars this time, but to his hand, the one that wore the Duke's signet ring. She did not take it. Instead, she gently laid her own dirt-stained fingers over his, a silent acknowledgement. A hospital will do a great deal of good for these people, she said, her voice soft, but clear for all to hear. And it will need a strong back to help with the building. A single, brilliant tear traced a path through the dust on Alistair's unscarred cheek. It was not a yes. It was not forgiveness. But it was a beginning. It was a chance. It was hope, sprouting like a resilient seedling in the most broken ground. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, holding on as if he were holding on to life itself. The villagers watched, some in stunned silence, others with slow, dawning smiles. They were witnessing not the conquest of a duke, but the quiet, tentative reconciliation of two souls who had found each other through a labyrinth of pain and deceit. The resolution was not swift, nor was it simple. It was built day by day, brick by brick, much like the new infirmary that began to rise at the edge of the village. Alistair, true to his word, took a room at the local inn. He shed his fine coats for the simple clothes of a workman, his soft hands quickly becoming calloused from hauling stone and mixing mortar alongside the other men. He was no longer the Duke of Blackwood to them. He was Alistair, the man who worked harder than anyone and spoke little, his eyes constantly seeking out Alara. Alara kept her distance at first, watching him. She saw him treat her father with a gentle respect that touched her deeply. She saw him share his midday meal with the other laborers, listening to their stories without a trace of condescension. She saw the change in him was not a performance. It was a profound transformation. He was earning his place, not with his wealth, but with his sweat and his humility. Their conversations started again, hesitantly in the evenings, among the rising walls of the infirmary. They spoke of herbs, of building plans, of the weather. They rebuilt their connection on a foundation of solid truth, no matter how mundane. One evening, as the sun set behind the half-finished building, he finally found the courage to speak of the future. "I meant what I said, Alara," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the structure. "About the title, I have sent word to my solicitors. The process of renouncing it is complex, but it is possible." She turned to him, a soft light in her eyes he hadn't seen since the day by the lake. "You don't have to do that, Alistair. The title is not the problem. The fear was, the pride was." She took a deep breath. "Blackwood is your home. You shouldn't abandon it. You should heal it, just as you are healing this village. Just as..." We are healing us. It was the first time she had used the word us. Alistair's heart swelled with a joy so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. He reached for her, and this time she did not pull away. She stepped into his arms, resting her head against his chest, and he held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, of lavender and earth and hope. They were married 3 months later, in the village church, just as the infirmary was completed. She wore a simple white dress, a crown of herbs in her hair. He wore a respectable suit, but on his hand was only a plain gold band, the ducal signet ring put away forever. She was not announced as the Duchess of Blackwood, but as Alara, his wife. Their return to Blackwood Manor was a quiet triumph. The house was no longer a tomb, but a home waiting to be filled with life. Alara's first act was to throw open all the windows, letting the sunlight and fresh air pour in, chasing away the dust and shadows. Together, they walked into the ruined rose garden. He looked at the thorns and decay, but for the first time, he did not see his own brokenness. He saw the promise of what could be. With Alara by his side, her hand held firmly in his, he picked up a pair of pruning shears and made the first cut.